The Wildlands Project is a very well-funded effort to lock up as much as 50% of the United States into wilderness. It is heavily promoted by most environmental, non-governmental organizations. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, helped create it in the mid-1980s to be the foundation of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which the IUCN wrote in 1982. The IUCN is an international group of over 1,000 NGO and government members. The founding members of Sovereignty International exposed this unbelievable plan in 1994 by obtaining incriminating evidence from the IUCN and giving it, along with this map, to the U.S. Senate an hour before the treaty was scheduled for ratification on September 29, 1994. Senate members were so shocked by this information and the map that the treaty was withdrawn and was never ratified. Nonetheless, tens of millions of dollars are being spent annually to implement it piecemeal without the treaty. With so much money to spend on implementation, it is on the fast track to completion. Animations in this presentation illustrate the progress made to date and what is being planned for the near future. The Wildlands Project is made up of three components: core reserves, interconnecting corridors, and a graduated buffer zone. More specifically, the core wildland reserves are no human-use wilderness areas that only allow limited hiking and perhaps some fishing. The interconnecting corridors are wilderness links between the wildland core reserves. The buffer zones are designed to protect the wildland attributes of the reserves and corridors. Buffers allow only very limited use near the reserves and corridors and more use further away. Although preposterous to most Americans, federal, state, and non-governmental organizations are gradually implementing the strategy by calling it a host of innocent-sounding names: gap analysis, open space, conservation areas, conservation easements, linkages, greenways, and many more. The first step in creating the Wildlands Project in the early 1990s was a thorough review of all existing government land for inclusion into the project. Most people are unaware that the federal government already owns 31% of all land in America. States and local government own another 9%, for a total of 40% owned by the government. The second step in creating the Wildlands Project in the early 1990s was to identify all protected land and identify specific areas that can be converted into wilderness. Existing wilderness areas automatically qualified. The Clinton administration then launched two programs: the Federal Gap Analysis and the Roadless Initiative. The gap analysis is a cooperative effort between federal and state agencies to classify all federal and state lands into four classes, from fully protected to no protection. The purpose is to identify gaps in ecosystem protection that need to be corrected by land acquisition programs. The Roadless Initiative identified all Forest Service lands for inclusion into wildlands that have no roads or have recently closed roads. The third step is to lobby Congress to make federal national parks and wildlife refuges more restrictive, thereby qualifying for wildland status. States also have created protected lands that can be included as wildlands. The best known of these are the Adirondack State Park in upstate New York, the New Jersey Pinelands, and the Florida Forever and Natural Areas programs. The fourth step is for environmental NGOs to lobby for conversion of federal and state land into wildland. Also, they need to lobby for the acquisition of key private land through purchase, conservation easements, or condemnation. These will be included as wildland reserves. This process is just getting underway, and the long-range goal of the Wildlands Project is to withdraw up to 50% of the land area in the United States from human use. The fifth step is to acquire or arbitrarily regulate key private land for inclusion as wildland reserves and corridors. Although it is just getting started, it has already harmed or even threatened communities and thousands of American families. The sixth step is to purchase private land or develop arbitrary regulations to create buffer zones around the wildland reserves and corridors. This step is also in its early stages. Since it undermines the very foundation of wealth creation, it will eventually have huge consequences on agriculture and other natural resource industries in America. In doing so, it will severely reduce the standard of living in the United States for all people and end the very property rights that have made this nation the greatest in the history of man.